The December wind howled across the Wyoming territory like a wounded beast, carrying with it a wall of snow that turned the world white and merciless. The year was 1882, and winter had come early to the vast stretches of grassland that rolled endlessly toward the dark mountains looming in the distance. Ice crystals danced in the air, sharp as needles, cutting through even the thickest wool coats. Through this frozen hell rode Jackson McCade, his broad shoulders hunched against the storm, his weathered Stetson pulled low over steel-gray eyes. At 35, he cut an imposing figure, even bent against the wind, 6 feet of hardened muscle wrapped in a thick sheepskin coat that had seen better days. His face, what could be seen of it beneath the brim of his hat, bore the marks of a man who'd lived hard, sun-weathered skin, a scar along his left jaw, and lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, though few in Willow Creek had seen much of the former in recent years. They called him the Billionaire Cowboy, though the term was more mockery than respect in these parts. True, he owned more land than any 3 men combined, 40,000 acres of prime grazing territory, 10,000 head of cattle, and mineral rights that went deep into the earth. But wealth hadn't bought him acceptance in the tight-knit community of Willow Creek. Not after what happened 5 years ago, not after the blood that had been spilled. Jackson urged his horse, a sturdy black stallion named Tempest, through the deepening drifts. He should have been back at the main house hours ago, but he'd stayed too long checking on the cattle in the north pasture, making sure they had shelter from the storm. Now darkness was falling, and the temperature with it, even for a man who'd spent his entire life in this unforgiving land. The cold was becoming dangerous. Meanwhile, 5 miles south, another traveler fought against the same storm, though with far less success. Margaret Maggie O'Brien clutched the reins of her rented wagon with fingers that had long since gone numb, her small frame shaking violently despite the layers of clothing she wore. At 24, she was new to the territory, having arrived just 3 months ago from Philadelphia to take up a teaching position at the newly established school for immigrant children in Willow Creek. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west seeking opportunity and freedom, only to find herself trapped in a prison of wind and snow. Her mare, a gentle creature named Clover, had been struggling for the past hour, her hooves slipping on the ice-covered trail. The wagon wheels, meant for dirt roads and gentle grades, were nearly useless in the deep snow. Maggie had stayed too late at the schoolhouse, determined to prepare lessons for the coming week. The storm had seemed manageable when she'd set out, just a light snowfall that reminded her of winter afternoons in Philadelphia. But the West had its own rules, its own savage beauty that could turn deadly in moments. Now, as the wind threatened to tear the bonnet from her head and snow blinded her vision, she realized the depth of her mistake. The wagon lurched suddenly, tilting at a dangerous angle as the right wheel caught in a hidden rut. Clover whinnied in distress. Struggling to maintain her footing, Maggie pulled hard on the reins, trying to guide the mare back to stable ground. But it was too late. With a sickening crack, the wagon's axle snapped. The vehicle collapsed sideways, throwing Maggie into the snow. She lay there for a moment, stunned, the cold seeping through her wool dress and petticoats. When she tried to stand, sharp pain shot through her left ankle. Not broken, she thought with relief, but badly twisted. Clover stood nearby, her sides heaving, ice forming on her mane. The wagon was beyond repair, tilted at an impossible angle with supplies scattered across the snow. Fear, real and primal, gripped Maggie's heart. She was miles from town, injured, with the night falling and the storm growing worse. Stories she'd heard in the saloon told in hushed whispers about travelers found frozen come spring suddenly seemed very real. She tried to remember the landmarks she'd passed, tried to calculate how far she'd come, but the swirling snow had erased all familiar markers. "Help!" she called out, though she knew it was futile. Her voice was swallowed by the wind before it traveled 10 feet. "Someone, please!" She limped to Clover, running her hands along the mare's neck. partly for comfort and partly to check for injuries. The horse seemed unhurt, but exhausted. Maggie knew she had two choices: try to ride Clover bareback through the storm or seek shelter and wait it out. Neither option seemed promising. That's when she heard it, the faint jingle of spurs and the snort of a horse. Through the white curtain of snow, a dark shape materialized. A rider, tall in the saddle, moving with the easy confidence of someone born to this land. As he drew closer, Maggie's relief battled with apprehension. Being rescued was one thing. Being found by the wrong sort of man was another danger entirely. Jackson had almost missed her. If Tempest hadn't shied at something the overturned wagon. As it turned out, he might have ridden past, leaving the woman to her fate. But now, seeing the small figure huddled next to the mare, her dark hair escaping from beneath a snow-covered bonnet, something stirred in his chest. Not quite compassion, he'd thought that emotion long dead, but perhaps an echo of the man he used to be. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. The woman backed away, fear evident in her green eyes despite her obvious distress. Jackson stopped, holding up his gloved hands in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke to anyone these days beyond what was necessary for business. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble." Maggie recognized him then, though they'd never formally met. The billionaire cowboy? The man mothers warned their daughters about, though the warnings were vague, wrapped in innuendo and half-truths. She'd seen him once in town, a solitary figure who moved through the streets like a shadow, speaking to no one, his very presence making folks uncomfortable. "Mr. McCade," she managed through chattering teeth. "My wagon, the axle broke. I'm afraid I've twisted my ankle as well." Jackson's eyes took in the scene with practiced efficiency: the ruined wagon, the exhausted horse, the way she favored her left foot. The teacher, he realized. He'd heard about her arrival, though he paid little attention to town gossip. Young, idealistic, probably full of dreams about civilizing the frontier. Now she was just another casualty of the land's indifference. "Can you ride?" he asked, already knowing what had to be done. I think so, but Clover is exhausted, and I'm not sure—" "Not your horse." Jackson interrupted. "Mine. Your mare won't make it a mile in this storm. We'll have to leave her." Maggie's eyes widened. "Leave her, but she'll die." "She might," Jackson said bluntly. "Or she might find shelter. Either way, she's got a better chance on her own than carrying you through this storm, and you'll die for certain if we don't get moving." The harsh truth of his words cut through Maggie's sentiment. This was the West, where harsh choices were a matter of survival. She nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. Jackson moved with surprising gentleness as he helped her to his horse. His hands were steady as he lifted her, careful of her injured ankle. For a moment, she was pressed against his chest, and she caught the scent of leather and wood smoke, oddly comforting in the chaos of the storm. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, creating a shelter of warmth. "My cabin's about 3 miles north," he said close to her ear to be heard over the wind. "It's the closest shelter. Can you hold on that long?" Maggie nodded, though she wasn't sure she could. The cold had seeped into her bones, making her drowsy. She knew that was dangerous, knew she had to stay awake. But the heat radiating from the man behind her was so inviting. Jackson felt her beginning to slump and tightened his hold. "Stay with me, Miss O'Brien. Don't you go to sleep on me now." He urged Tempest forward, trusting the stallion's instincts to find the way home. The storm raged around them, turning the familiar landscape into an alien world, more than once. Jackson had to pause, squinting through the snow to find a landmark, a distinctive rock formation. A stand of pines, anything to confirm they were heading in the right direction. Behind them, Clover stood for a moment, watching them disappear into the white void. Then, following some ancient instinct, she began to move. seeking the lee of a rocky outcropping where she might wait out the storm. The wagon remained, already beginning to disappear under a shroud of snow, its scattered contents books, mainly, and teaching supplies slowly being buried. As they rode, Jackson found himself oddly aware of the woman in his arms. It had been years since he'd been this close to anyone, let alone a woman. She was smaller than he'd expected, delicate almost, though he suspected there was steel beneath that fragility. There had to be, for a woman to come alone to this unforgiving place. "Why were you out in this storm?" he asked, partly to keep her conscious and partly from genuine curiosity. "The children," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Need to prepare. Their lessons. They're counting on me." Something in her tone, the dedication despite her current peril, stirred memories Jackson had tried to bury. Another woman's voice, full of similar passion, similar hope, before the gunfire, before everything went to hell. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the immediate challenge. The cabin had to be close now. He could feel Tempest's labored breathing, knew even his sturdy mount was reaching his limits. Then, through a brief break in the storm, he saw it, the dark shape of his cabin, smoke still rising from the chimney. "Almost there," he told the half-conscious woman in his arms. "Just hold on a little longer." The final 100 yards seemed to take forever, but finally they were at the door. Jackson dismounted carefully, keeping Maggie from falling, then lifted her down. She was barely conscious now, her body limp in his arms. He kicked open the door, carrying her inside to warmth and safety. The cabin was modest but well-built, designed to withstand the worst the mountains could offer. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Jackson laid Maggie on the thick rug before the fire, then quickly returned to tend to Tempest, knowing the horse had saved both their lives. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he found Maggie stirring, her eyes focusing on the unfamiliar surroundings. Fear flashed across her face before she remembered. "You're safe," Jackson said, keeping his distance, understanding her apprehension. "The storm's not letting up anytime soon. Looks like we'll be here a while." As the wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, two strangers from different worlds found themselves thrown together by the caprice of nature. Neither could know that this night would change everything that in saving her life. Jackson McCade had taken the first step toward saving his own soul. The cabin's interior revealed itself to Maggie in fragments as her vision cleared. Rough-hewn logs formed the walls, chinked with mud and moss to keep out the wind. A single room served multiple purposes: kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters all merged into one space, simple but clean, with everything in its place. A narrow bed occupied one corner. A small table with 2 chairs sat near the window, and shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and a few worn books. But it was the fireplace that drew her attention, its warmth calling to her frozen body like a siren's song. She tried to move closer but gasped as pain shot through her ankle. "Stay still," Jackson commanded, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "Let me look at that ankle first." He knelt beside her with surprising grace for such a large man, his hands gentle as he unlaced her boot. Maggie bit her lip to keep from crying out as he eased it off, along with her soaked stocking. Her ankle was already swelling, purple bruises beginning to bloom across the pale skin. "Not broken," he confirmed, echoing her earlier assessment. "But you won't be walking on it for a few days." He glanced up at her, and for a moment their eyes met. The storm won't pass before then anyway. The reality of her situation struck Maggie with full force. She was trapped in a remote cabin with a man she didn't know, a man with a dangerous reputation, while a blizzard raged outside. Her reputation, already precarious as a young unmarried woman living alone, would be in ruins if anyone found out. As if reading her thoughts, Jackson stood and moved away, busying himself at the small stove. "Nothing to be done about it now," he said gruffly, You'd be dead if I'd left you out there. The town gossips will have to make do with speculation. Despite her anxiety, Maggie found herself studying him as he worked, without his heavy coat. She could see the lean strength in his movements, the way he handled the simple task of making coffee with economical precision. His dark hair, longer than was fashionable, curled slightly at his collar. When he turned to reach for something, she noticed how his flannel shirt stretched across broad shoulders. "You're shivering," he observed, setting a steaming cup on the floor beside her. "Those wet clothes need to come off." Maggie's eyes widened in alarm, and Jackson held up a hand. "There's a blanket in the chest by the bed. I'll step outside, give you privacy to change. Hang your things by the fire to dry." He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, pausing at the threshold. "The coffee's hot, drink it slow, and Miss O'Brien," he glanced back. "I may be many things, but I'm not the kind of man who'd take advantage of a woman in distress. You're safe here." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow, leaving Maggie alone with her thoughts and the crackling fire. She struggled out of her wet clothes with difficulty, her frozen fingers fumbling with buttons and laces. The wool dress, once her best, was likely ruined. Her petticoats clung to her legs like icy shrouds. By the time she'd stripped down to her chemise and wrapped herself in the thick wool blanket, her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely hold the coffee cup. The liquid was black as sin and strong enough to peel paint, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. She sipped it gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her chest, around her. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, but the walls held firm. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Jackson knocked on the door. "Decent." "Yes," Maggie called, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He entered, bringing with him a gust of frigid air and a small avalanche of snow. His face was reddened by the cold, ice crystals clinging to his dark stubble. He'd been checking on his horse, she realized, making sure Tempest was secure in whatever shelter they had. "How's the coffee?" he asked, settling into a chair at the table, maintaining a respectful distance. "Strong," she admitted with a small smile. "But welcome." "That's the only way to make it out here." He poured himself a cup, his large hands dwarfing the tin mug. "Strong coffee, strong whiskey, strong constitution, the holy trinity of frontier survival." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the howling wind and the pop of burning wood. Maggie shifted, trying to find a comfortable position for her injured ankle. "I should thank you," she said finally, "for saving my life." Jackson shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Maggie said quietly. "They wouldn't have, and we both know it." He looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time since bringing her inside. Even bedraggled, with her dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face. She was pretty in a way that had nothing to do with frontier hardiness. There was something refined about her features, a delicacy that spoke of education and gentle upbringing. What was a woman like her doing in a place like Willow Creek? "Why did you come here?" he asked abruptly. "To Wyoming. I mean, you're clearly not cut out for this life." Maggie bristled at his assessment, even as she knew it was partly true. "Because they needed a teacher," she said with dignity. "Because those children deserve an education just as much as any child in Philadelphia or Boston." "Noble sentiments," Jackson said, but there was no mockery in his tone. "But this land doesn't care about noble sentiments. It'll kill you just as quick as it'll kill a claim jumper or a cattle rustler." "Perhaps," Maggie conceded. "But what's the alternative? Let those children grow up without learning to read or write. Let ignorance and poverty trap them forever." Her passion surprised him. It had been a long time since he'd heard anyone speak with such conviction about anything beyond survival and profit. "You really believe you can make a difference?" "I have to believe it," she said simply. "Otherwise, what's the point of any of it?" Jackson fell silent, staring into his coffee. Her words stirred something in him. Memories of another time when he'd believed in things beyond the daily struggle for existence. Before Sarah. Before the gunfight that had changed everything. "Tell me about your students," he said, surprising himself with the request. Maggie's face lit up, and she began to speak about the children Polish immigrants' sons and daughters. A few Mexican families who'd stayed after the railroad work dried up. Even some Chinese children whose parents had somehow made their way to this unlikely place. She spoke of their eagerness to learn, their quick minds, the way they soaked up knowledge like desert soil after rain. As she talked, Jackson found himself drawn into her world. He asked questions, genuinely curious about her teaching methods, the challenges she faced. She told him about making do with few supplies, about parents who were suspicious of education, about children who came to school hungry and left reluctant to go home. "There's one boy," she said, her voice soft with affection. "Miguel, 8 years old. His father died in a mining accident last year, and his mother takes in washing to make ends meet. But he's brilliant. Mr. McCade. Give him a book, and he devours it. He's already reading at a level most 12-year-olds can't manage." "What will happen to him?" Jackson asked. "A Mexican boy with no father, no matter how smart." "That's why I'm here," Maggie said fiercely. "To give him and children like him a chance. Education is the great equalizer. Mr. McCade. It's the only thing that can truly change a person's circumstances." "You're an idealist," he observed. "And you're a cynic," she countered. "Life has a way of doing that to a person," Jackson said quietly. They talked on as the storm raged outside, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. Jackson found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken of in years, his early days as a cowhand, working for other men until he'd saved enough to buy his first piece of land, the lucky strike of silver on his property that had made his fortune, the way money had changed everything and nothing. "They call you the billionaire cowboy," Maggie said at one point, "though I suspect it's not meant kindly." Jackson's face darkened. "People fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand a man who keeps to himself, who doesn't need their approval or their friendship." "Is that what you prefer, solitude?" He was quiet for a long moment. "It's simpler," he said finally. "Less complicated." Maggie sensed the pain beneath his words, but didn't press. Instead, she shifted the conversation to safer topics, books they'd both read, places they'd dreamed of seeing. She was surprised to discover he was well-read, self-educated but thoughtful in his observations. As the night wore on, Maggie began to yawn, exhaustion finally overcoming her. Jackson noticed immediately. "You should rest," he said, standing. "Take the bed. I'll make do with the floor by the fire." "I couldn't," Maggie began to protest. "You're injured and exhausted," he said firmly. "And despite what the good people of Willow Creek might think, I'm still a gentleman. Take the bed, Miss O'Brien." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she hobbled to the narrow bed. It smelled of pine and leather. Undeniably masculine, but clean. She sank onto it gratefully, her ankle throbbing. Jackson brought her another blanket, tucking it around her with unexpected tenderness. "The storm should pass by morning," he said. "We'll figure out how to get you back to town then." "Mr. McCade," Maggie said as he turned to go. "Thank you, not just for saving me, but for tonight, for treating me with respect." Something shifted in his expression, a flash of vulnerability quickly hidden. "Get some sleep, Miss O'Brien." He settled himself by the fire, his broad back to her, giving her privacy. Maggie watched him for a moment, this complicated man who was nothing like the monster the townspeople had painted him to be. Then exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted off to sleep, feeling safer than she had any right to feel in a stranger's cabin. Outside, the storm continued its assault, as if the very heavens were conspiring to keep them together. Snow piled against the windows, sealing them in their temporary shelter. And somewhere in the darkness between sleep and waking, between the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire, something indefinable began to take shape, fragile as frost on a window pane, but with the potential to change everything. The title of their story whispered through the cabin like a promise. Billionaire Cowboy rescues shivering teacher in snow with a touch in the cabin that heats the night. But the real warmth came not from the fire or the blankets, but from two lonely souls finding unexpected connection in the midst of nature's fury. Maggie woke to the sound of splitting wood and the aroma of frying bacon. For a moment, disoriented, she couldn't place where she was. Then memory rushed back the storm. The rescue. Jackson McCade's cabin. Pale light filtered through the frost-covered windows, suggesting dawn had broken. But the wind still howled outside. She sat up carefully, testing her ankle. Still swollen, still painful, but perhaps marginally better. Her dress hung by the fireplace, dry now but wrinkled beyond salvation. She was reaching for it when Jackson entered, carrying an armload of firewood. "Storm's not done with us yet," he said by way of greeting, not looking at her directly. "Could be another day or two before it's safe to travel." Maggie's heart sank. 2 more days meant her reputation would be thoroughly shredded, but there was nothing to be done about it. "I see," she managed. "There's breakfast," Jackson continued, still avoiding her gaze as he stacked the wood. "And I found some clothes that might fit. They were my sister's." The unexpected mention of a sister made Maggie look up sharply. Jackson's jaw had tightened, as if he regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. "Your sister?" she ventured carefully. "She's dead," he said flatly, then gestured to a bundle on the table. "The clothes are clean. They'll do better than that wet dress." He left again, giving her privacy to change. The clothes, a simple calico dress and wool shawl, were well made but dated, as if they'd been stored away for years. They fit reasonably well, though Maggie was slightly taller than their original owner had been. When Jackson returned, he served up a simple breakfast of bacon, biscuits, and more of that paint-stripping coffee. They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness of the previous night somewhat diminished. "I should check on Tempest," Jackson said when they'd finished. "See how he weathered the night." "Could I come?" Maggie asked impulsively. "I'd like to see how he's doing. He saved both our lives." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. He helped her into his sister's old coat and supported her as they made their way through the knee-deep snow to the lean-to shelter attached to the cabin. Tempest nickered softly when he saw them, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The shelter was basic but solid, protecting the horse from the worst of the storm. Jackson had rigged a makeshift stall with rope and blankets. "He's a magnificent animal," Maggie said, reaching out to stroke Tempest's neck. The stallion leaned into her touch. "Surprising, Jackson." "He doesn't usually take to strangers," he observed. "Perhaps he knows I owe him my life," Maggie said softly. She produced a withered apple from her pocket, saved from her teaching supplies. "May I?" Jackson nodded, watching as she fed Tempest the treat. There was something natural about the way she handled the horse, despite her city upbringing. "You've been around horses before," he said. It wasn't a question. "My grandfather bred them back in Ireland," Maggie explained. "Before the famine. Before we lost everything and came to America." She smiled sadly. "He used to say horses could see into a person's soul, know their true nature." "And what does Tempest see in mine?" Jackson asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Maggie looked at him thoughtfully. "A good man trying very hard to convince the world he isn't." The directness of her observation caught him off guard. Before he could respond, she shivered violently, the cold finally penetrating her borrowed coat. "We should get back inside," Jackson said gruffly, grateful for the excuse to end the conversation. Back in the cabin, they settled into an easier rhythm. Maggie insisted on helping with chores despite her injury, hobbling about to wash dishes and tidy the already neat space. Jackson tried to protest, but quickly learned that Margaret O'Brien had a stubborn streak that rivaled his own. As the day wore on, they found themselves talking again. Safer topics at first, the challenges of ranching, amusing stories about her students, observations about the differences between eastern cities and western territories. But gradually, inevitably, the conversation deepened. "Why teaching?" Jackson asked at one point. "A woman with your education could have done anything. Married well, certainly." Maggie's laugh was bitter. "Married well. Yes, that was certainly my mother's plan. She had a banker picked out for me. Harold Worthington III, 30 years my senior, with hands like dead fish and breath that could wilt flowers." Jackson snorted despite himself. "Sounds like a catch." "Oh, he was considered quite the prize," Maggie said dryly. "Rich, respectable, looking for a young wife to give him sons and host his dinner parties. The fact that I had opinions, that I'd been educated, was considered an unfortunate flaw he was willing to overlook. So you ran away to Wyoming instead." "I didn't run," Maggie corrected with dignity. I chose to use my education for something meaningful rather than waste it planning menus and managing servants." "And your family disowned me," she said simply. "My mother said I was a disgrace to the O'Brien name. My father just looked disappointed, which was worse somehow." Jackson understood that kind of disappointment. The weight of failing to meet expectations. "Family can be the heaviest chains we wear," he said quietly. Speaking from experience. He was quiet for so long Maggie thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the fire, he began to speak. "My father built this ranch from nothing. Came out here in a 49 with nothing but determination and a strong back. Fought Indians, weather, claim jumpers. Built something substantial. He expected me to be just like him, hard, ruthless when necessary, caring only about the land and the cattle. But you weren't," Maggie said softly. "I tried to be. God knows I tried. But Sarah—" He stopped, the name hanging in the air between them like a ghost. "Your sister." "My wife," Jackson corrected, his voice rough. "She was my wife." Maggie's breath caught. Wife, not sister. The clothes she wore belonged to a dead wife, not a sister. The pain in his voice was raw, even after what must have been years. "She was like you," Jackson continued, seeming unable to stop now that he'd started. "Idealistic, believed in education, in civilization coming to the frontier. She started the first school in Willow Creek. Actually, in our barn at first, then in town when we could afford to build properly." "What happened?" Maggie asked gently. "Land dispute. Neighboring rancher named Garrett claimed our water rights. Came with guns to enforce it. I was in town when they came. Sarah." His hands clenched into fists. "She tried to reason with them. Thought words could solve everything. They shot her for it. She died in my arms an hour later." The silence that followed was heavy with grief and understanding. Maggie reached out instinctively, placing her hand over his clenched fist. He didn't pull away. "You killed them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Every last one," Jackson confirmed. "Fair fight. The law said self-defense. But the town—" He laughed bitterly. "The town decided I was a killer. Never mind that Garrett drew first. Never mind that they murdered an innocent woman. I became the monster, the man who solved problems with violence." "That's why you stay away." Maggie understood. "Why you keep to yourself." "It's better that way. Safer. For everyone." "Is it?" Maggie challenged. "Or is it just easier hiding away here, nursing your grief, letting the town think the worst of you?" Jackson's eyes flashed dangerously. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Maggie stood, favoring her injured ankle but drawing herself up to her full height. "I know what it's like to lose everything, to have your world torn apart. But I also know that hiding from life isn't living. It's just existing." "And what would you have me do?" Jackson demanded, standing as well. Pretend the past didn't happen, forget Sarah existed. No, Maggie said fiercely. Remember her by living the way she would have wanted. She believed in education. Then why do the children of Willow Creek struggle with outdated books and broken slates while you sit on enough wealth to build 10 schools? The accusation hung between them, sharp as winter wind. Jackson's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. You don't understand. I understand that grief can become a comfortable prison, Maggie interrupted. I understand that it's easier to be the monster they think you are than to risk being hurt again. But Jackson... She used his given name for the first time, her voice softening. Sarah wouldn't want this for you. He turned away from her, shoulders rigid with tension. Outside, the storm continued its assault. But inside the cabin, another kind of storm was brewing, one of long-suppressed emotions and hard truths. She was pregnant, Jackson said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. 8 months along, we were going to name him James, after her father. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. The loss was even greater than she'd imagined. Now do you understand? Jackson asked, turning back to her. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. They didn't just kill my wife. They killed my future. Everything I'd hoped for, planned for, gone in a moment of senseless violence. Without thinking, Maggie crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around him. He stood rigid for a moment. Then something broke inside him. His arms came around her, crushing her against his chest as 5 years of grief poured out in shuddering breaths. They stood that way for long minutes, 2 damaged souls finding solace in shared pain. When Jackson finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer somehow, as if a poison had been drawn out. I'm sorry, he said roughly. Don't be, Maggie replied, wiping her own tears. Never apologize for grieving someone you loved. The moment had shifted something between them, torn down walls that had stood for years. They were no longer strangers brought together by chance, but 2 people who had seen each other's deepest wounds and hadn't turned away. As night fell again and the storm showed no signs of abating, they prepared a simple supper together, moving around each other with newfound ease. The conversation was lighter now, but threaded through with deeper understanding. Tell me about the school Sarah started, Maggie requested as they ate. Jackson obliged, sharing memories of his wife's passion for education, her battles with the town council, her joy when the first students graduated. As he talked, Maggie saw the man he'd been before tragedy struck, hopeful, engaged with his community, building something more than just wealth. She would have liked you, Jackson said finally. You have the same fire, the same stubborn belief that things can be better. I would have liked to know her, Maggie replied sincerely. Outside, the wind began to die down, the storm finally exhausting itself. Tomorrow, perhaps, they could attempt the journey back to town, but tonight, in the warm circle of firelight, 2 souls continued their tentative dance toward trust, toward healing, toward something neither quite dared name yet. The journey back to Willow Creek took most of the morning. Jackson had fashioned a makeshift sled from timber and rope, hitching it to Tempest to transport Maggie and what supplies they could salvage from her wagon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed crystalline white under a harsh winter sun, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. They rode in relative silence, both aware that their return to town would shatter the strange intimacy they'd found in the cabin. Jackson's jaw was set in grim lines, already steeling himself for what was to come. Maggie clutched the borrowed shawl tighter, trying not to think about the whispers that would follow her for weeks, perhaps months. They entered Willow Creek from the north, taking the main street that ran past the mercantile, the saloon, and the church. It was just past noon, the worst possible time when the most people would be about their business, able to witness their arrival. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Women pulled their children closer. Men stepped out of doorways to stare. Mrs. Abigail Morrison. The minister's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, actually gasped aloud when she saw Maggie wearing what she clearly recognized as Sarah McCade's dress. Jackson helped Maggie down from the sled in front of the boarding house where she kept a room, his movements deliberately careful and impersonal. But the damage was already done. In the eyes of Willow Creek, Margaret O'Brien had spent 3 nights alone with the town's most notorious resident. "Thank you, Mr. McCade," Maggie said formally, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I'm very grateful for your assistance during the storm." Jackson tipped his hat, playing his part in the charade. "Ma'am." He turned to go, but Maggie caught his arm. "Your sister's clothes," she said. "I'll have them cleaned and returned." A muscle jumped in his jaw at the necessary lie. "No need. Miss O'Brien, good day." He mounted Tempest and rode away without looking back, leaving Maggie to face the crowd alone. She squared her shoulders and limped toward the boarding house entrance, where Mrs. Elmira Hartwell, the proprietress, stood with arms crossed and lips pursed. "Miss O'Brien, Mrs." Hartwell's voice could have frozen water. "I trust you have an explanation for your absence." "I was caught in the storm. Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. McCade was kind enough to provide shelter. I would have died otherwise." "Shelter, Mrs." Hartwell repeated, making the word sound sordid. "For 3 days, alone, with that man." "Would you have preferred I froze to death to preserve propriety?" Maggie asked sharply, her patience already fraying. "Mrs." Hartwell's face reddened. "What I would prefer is that my boarders maintain appropriate behavior. I run a respectable establishment. Miss O'Brien, I cannot have questionable women under my roof." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. "Questionable I was rescued from certain death. By a killer," someone in the crowd muttered. "Everyone knows what kind of man Jackson McCade is. And now we know what kind of woman would spend 3 days with him," another voice added. Maggie looked around at the faces she'd come to know over the past months, parents of her students, shopkeepers she'd bought from, women she'd exchanged pleasantries with. Now they all wore the same expression of scandalized judgment. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly to Mrs. Hartwell. "See that you do, by tomorrow noon." Maggie climbed the stairs to her room on unsteady legs, her ankles screaming with each step. Behind her, the crowd dispersed, eager to spread the gossip throughout town. By evening, everyone would know. By tomorrow, her position at the school would likely be in jeopardy. She sank onto her narrow bed, finally allowing the tears to fall. Not for herself, she'd survived worse than small-town gossip, but for her students. What would happen to Miguel and the others if she was forced to leave? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Elena Rodriguez, Miguel's mother, standing in the hallway. The Mexican woman's face was sympathetic rather than judgmental. "Miss O'Brien," Elena said softly, "I wanted to say, we don't all believe the worst. My Miguel, he tells me you are a good woman, a good teacher." "Thank you, Elena," Maggie managed. "But I fear that won't matter to the school board." "Perhaps not," Elena agreed. "But it matters to us. The families who need you. Don't give up so easily. Yes." After Elena left, Maggie spent the evening packing her few belongings and trying to prepare arguments for the school board meeting that would surely come. She was so absorbed that she almost missed the second knock at her door. This time, it was Thomas Brennan, president of the school board and owner of the largest bank in town. His presence in the boarding house after dark would itself be scandalous under normal circumstances, which told Maggie how serious the situation was. "Miss O'Brien," he said without preamble. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, noting how he carefully left the door partially open, protecting his reputation, if not hers. "I assume you've heard the talk." Brennan began. "Rather hard to miss," Maggie replied dryly. "Yes, well," he cleared his throat. The board will be meeting tomorrow evening to discuss your situation. I wanted to give you the opportunity to resign quietly. Spare yourself the embarrassment of a public hearing." "How thoughtful," Maggie said, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "Tell me, Mr. Brennan, what exactly am I accused of being caught in a blizzard accepting shelter rather than freezing to death?" "You know it's not that simple," Brennan said uncomfortably. "The appearance of impropriety." "Appearance?" Maggie interrupted. "Not actual impropriety, just the appearance of it. And that's enough to cost me my position. This is a small town. Miss O'Brien, parents must have confidence in the moral character of those who teach their children. And my moral character is determined by circumstances beyond my control." Maggie stood, ignoring the pain in her ankle. "Mr. McCade saved my life. Nothing inappropriate occurred. We waited out a storm, that's all." Brennan's expression was skeptical. 3 days. Miss O'Brien. 3 days alone with a man who... He trailed off. "Who what?" Maggie demanded. "Who killed the men who murdered his pregnant wife? Yes, Mr. Brennan. I know the story now. The real story. Not the whispered half-truths this town prefers. Jackson McCade is a dangerous man," Brennan said firmly. "His presence brings violence. The town has been peaceful since he started keeping to himself." "Peaceful?" Maggie repeated. "Yes, I suppose it's peaceful when you exile anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of respectability. Tell me, do you sleep well knowing you've turned a grieving widower into a pariah?" Brennan's face hardened. "I came here as a courtesy. Miss O'Brien, the board meeting is tomorrow at 7. You may attend to speak in your defense, or you may submit your resignation before then. Good evening." After he left, Maggie stood at her window, looking out at the town she'd tried so hard to make her home. Lamplight glowed in windows, families gathering for evening meals, children she'd taught settling down to homework. It all seemed very far away now. Movement in the street below caught her eye. A lone rider, sitting still as stone in the shadow between buildings. Even in the darkness, she recognized Jackson's silhouette. He was watching her window. She realized, checking to see if she was all right. The gesture touched her more than she could say. She raised her hand slightly, letting him know she saw him. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned tempest and disappeared into the night. The next day brought fresh humiliations. When Maggie arrived at the schoolhouse, she found half her usual students absent. The ones who did attend were subdued, clearly aware of the scandal surrounding their teacher. Even Miguel seemed uncertain, though he managed a small smile when she praised his reading. During lunch, she overheard 2 mothers talking outside the window. "Can you imagine 3 days with that killer? She must be either very brave or very foolish. Or very wanton." The other replied, "No decent woman would put herself in such a position. I heard she was wearing his dead wife's clothes when they returned. The nerve of it." "Well, what can you expect from these Eastern women? They come here with their modern ideas, thinking they're too good for our ways." Maggie closed her eyes, fighting back anger and hurt. She'd given everything to this town, to these children, and it counted for nothing against the weight of gossip and prejudice. That afternoon, she received another visitor, Reverend Morrison, accompanied by his wife. They sat in her small parlor like judges at a trial. "Miss O'Brien," the Reverend began in his sonorous preaching voice, "we've come to offer you spiritual guidance in this difficult time." "How kind," Maggie said neutrally. "The path of righteousness is not always easy." "Mrs.," Morrison added, her pinched face radiating disapproval. "But confession and repentance can cleanse even the most sullied soul." "I have nothing to confess," Maggie said firmly, "and nothing to repent." "Pride," Reverend Morrison intoned, "goeth before a fall. Surely you see how your actions have compromised not only your own reputation, but the moral standing of the school itself." "My actions," Maggie's temper finally snapped. My actions were to accept rescue from a blizzard. Would you have preferred I maintain my reputation by dying virtuously in the snow? There's no need for sarcasm, Mrs. Morrison huffed. We're trying to help you. No, Maggie said, standing despite the protest from her ankle. You're trying to make me admit to sins I didn't commit so you can feel justified in your judgment. Mr. McCade showed me more Christian charity in those 3 days than this entire town has shown him in 5 years. The Morrisons left in high dudgeon, promising to pray for her soul. Maggie suspected their prayers would be more focused on her swift departure from Willow Creek. As evening approached and the school board meeting drew near, Maggie dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, the blue wool she saved for church and special occasions. She pinned her hair severely back, trying to project an image of propriety and professionalism. Walking to the town hall where the meeting would be held, she passed several people she knew. Most looked away. A few whispered behind their hands, but Elena Rodriguez nodded encouragingly, and old Mr. Chen from the laundry gave her a slight bow. The town hall was already crowded when she arrived. It seemed half of Willow Creek had come to witness her humiliation. The 5 members of the school board sat at a table in front, their faces grave. Thomas Brennan avoided her eyes. Miss O'Brien, he said formally, you may take the seat provided. The seat was positioned facing both the board and the crowd, designed to maximize her exposure to public scrutiny. Maggie sat with as much dignity as she could muster, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The meeting was called to order, and Brennan read the charges against her in bureaucratic language that somehow made accepting shelter from a storm sound like the worst kind of moral turpitude. When he finished, he looked at her over his spectacles. How do you answer these concerns, Miss O'Brien? Maggie stood slowly, favoring her injured ankle, and faced the assembly. The hall fell silent except for the occasional creak of wooden chairs and the whisper of winter wind against the windows. Members of the board, citizens of Willow Creek, she began, her voice clear despite her nervousness. I stand accused of accepting shelter during a life-threatening blizzard. If this is a crime, then I am guilty. But I submit that dying to preserve appearances would have served no one, least of all the children I came here to teach. The issue, interrupted Clarence Dobbs, the town's wealthiest merchant and board member, is not merely the shelter, Miss O'Brien, but the circumstances. 3 nights alone with a man of questionable reputation. Questionable, Maggie's voice sharpened. Based on what? That he defended himself against men who murdered his pregnant wife, that he chooses solitude over the hypocrisy of those who condemned him for seeking justice. A murmur ran through the crowd. Speaking of Sarah McCade's death so bluntly was considered poor taste. Furthermore, Maggie continued, Mr. McCade behaved as a complete gentleman throughout our enforced proximity. He gave up his bed, maintained respectful distance, and treated me with nothing but courtesy. Can everyone in this room claim they would have shown such restraint and honor? Pretty words, scoffed Mrs. Morrison from the audience. But we have only your word for what transpired. And my word is not enough. Maggie turned to face the crowd. I have been in this community for 3 months. I have taught your children, visited your sick, contributed to your church. Has my conduct ever given you reason to doubt my character before this? You're young, said board member Franklin Hayes, not unkindly. Perhaps you don't understand how these things appear. I understand perfectly, Maggie interrupted. I understand that this town would rather cling to its prejudices than acknowledge the truth. I understand that Jackson McCade has been made a scapegoat for 5 years because it's easier than admitting this community failed him in his darkest hour. The crowd stirred uneasily. Brennan gavelled for order. Miss O'Brien, we're here to discuss your situation, not Mr. McCade's past. But they're connected, aren't they? Maggie pressed on. My real crime isn't accepting shelter. It's associating with someone you've all decided to shun. Well, I've seen more Christianity in Jackson McCade's actions than in this entire proceeding. Blasphemy, Mrs. Morrison cried out. Is it? Maggie whirled to face her. Christ ate with tax collectors and sinners. He showed compassion to outcasts. What have you shown, Mr. McCade, except judgment and isolation? Before anyone could respond, the heavy doors at the back of the hall swung open. A gust of cold air swept in, along with the last person anyone expected to see. Jackson McCade strode down the center aisle, his spurs ringing against the floorboards. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a black suit that emphasized his imposing height. The crowd shrank back as he passed, as if his very presence might contaminate them. Mr. McCade, Brennan said weakly. This is a closed session. About me, apparently, Jackson said, his deep voice filling the space. Seems I have a right to speak. He positioned himself not beside Maggie, but slightly in front of her, a protective stance that wasn't lost on anyone present. 5 years ago, he began without preamble. My wife was murdered, shot down like a dog for trying to protect what was ours. I killed the men responsible. The law cleared me. But this town... He looked around the room, his gaze stopping on familiar faces. This town decided I was the villain. Mr. McCade, Brennan tried again. This isn't relevant. Isn't it? Jackson's voice was dangerously quiet. You're ready to destroy this woman's reputation, her livelihood, because she accepted my help, because she didn't choose death over my company. What does that say about you? He turned to address the crowd directly. You want to know what happened in that cabin, I'll tell you. I found a woman near death in the snow. I gave her shelter. I gave her food and warmth. I kept my distance and treated her with respect. And when the storm cleared, I brought her home. That's all. We have only your word, Dobbs began. My word used to mean something in this town. Jackson cut him off. Before grief made me inconvenient. Before my pain made you uncomfortable. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coin. But if my word isn't enough, perhaps this is $20,000. My donation to the school, on one condition Miss O'Brien keeps her position. Gasps echoed through the hall. It was more money than the school had seen in its entire existence. You can't buy respectability. McCade, someone called out. I'm not trying to, Jackson replied. I'm trying to buy education for children who deserve better than your narrow-minded prejudice. This is bribery, Mrs. Morrison shrieked. This is philanthropy, Jackson corrected. Something my Sarah believed in, something Miss O'Brien believes in. The question is, what do you believe in your gossip and judgment, or the future of your children? Maggie stepped forward, touching his arm lightly. Jackson, no, I won't have you buying my position. He looked down at her, and for a moment, the mask slipped. The tenderness in his eyes was unmistakable. You won't have these vultures destroying you for helping me either. Vultures, Dobbs sputtered, face reddening. What else would you call those who circle the wounded, waiting to pick the bones? Jackson's voice hardened again. You've had your pound of flesh from me. You won't have hers. And Mr. McCade, Brennan said, clearly struggling to regain control of the meeting. Your offer is generous, but it doesn't address the moral concerns. Moral concerns. Jackson laughed bitterly. When Samuel Henderson beats his wife, you all look the other way. When Jake Collins drinks away his family's food money, you say it's not your business. But a teacher accepts shelter in a blizzard, and suddenly you're all paragons of virtue. The uncomfortable truth of his words settled over the room like a shroud. Several people shifted uneasily, unable to meet his gaze. I have a proposal. A new voice spoke up. It was Dr. Marcus Finch, the town physician and the fifth board member who'd remained silent until now. Miss O'Brien has been an exemplary teacher. Her students show marked improvement. The unusual circumstances of the storm were beyond anyone's control. Marcus, Mrs. Morrison hissed. Surely you're not suggesting— I'm suggesting, Dr. Finch continued firmly, that we judge Miss O'Brien on her performance as an educator, not on circumstances beyond her control. And if Mr. McCade wishes to support the school financially, we should consider it a blessing, not a bribe. Thank you, Dr. Finch, Maggie said quietly. However, the doctor added, to quiet concerns about propriety, perhaps Miss O'Brien could agree to certain conditions, regular meetings with Mrs. Morrison for spiritual guidance, a commitment to avoid any appearance of impropriety in the future. You mean avoid Mr. McCade, Maggie said flatly. If necessary for the sake of the school. Doctor, Finch said apologetically. Maggie felt something fierce rise in her chest. No. No, Brennan echoed. No, Maggie repeated more firmly. I will not agree to shun a man who saved my life to appease small-minded gossips. I will not perpetuate the cruelty this town has shown him. If that costs me my position, so be it. Miss O'Brien. Doctor, Finch said gently, think of your students. I am thinking of them, Maggie interrupted. What lesson do I teach if I bow to prejudice? What do I show them about integrity if I abandon someone who showed me kindness? Jackson turned to look at her fully then, something wondering in his expression. Maggie, he said quietly, forgetting formality. Don't throw away your life's work for me. I'm not throwing anything away, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm standing for what's right. The room erupted in chaos. Board members huddled in heated discussion. Crowd members argued among themselves. Through it all, Maggie and Jackson stood like an island of calm in a stormy sea. Finally, Brennan called for order. The board will vote, all in favor of retaining Miss O'Brien without conditions. Dr. Finch raised his hand. Alone. All in favor of retaining Miss O'Brien with the conditions outlined by Dr. Finch. No hands. All in favor of terminating Miss O'Brien's employment. 4 hands rose. Brennan, Dobbs, Hayes, and the 4th member, Walter Schmidt. Motion carries. Brennan said heavily, Miss O'Brien, your employment is terminated effective immediately. Please remove your belongings from the schoolhouse by week's end. The decision hit Maggie like a physical blow, but she kept her head high. And Mr. McCade's donation. Rejected, Dobbs said smugly. We won't have blood money in our school. Then you won't have much of a school, Jackson said coldly. Good luck finding another teacher willing to work for what you pay in a town that destroys anyone who doesn't conform. He offered Maggie his arm. Allow me to escort you out, Miss O'Brien. She took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the wool of his jacket. Together they walked through the crowd, which parted before them like the Red Sea. Some faces showed sympathy. Elena Rodriguez had tears in her eyes, but most displayed satisfaction or righteous vindication. Outside in the cold night air, Maggie finally allowed her composure to crack. My students, she whispered. What will happen to them? That's no longer your burden, Jackson said gently. You did more than anyone could ask. It wasn't enough. It never is, in places like this. He studied her face in the moonlight. What will you do now? I don't know, Maggie admitted. I have nowhere to go, no money saved, no references now. She laughed bitterly. I seem to have burned all my bridges quite thoroughly. There's another option, Jackson said carefully. The offer I made inside the donation, it doesn't have to go to the school. You could use it to start over somewhere else, somewhere that might appreciate what you have to offer. I won't take your money, Maggie said firmly. Not even as a loan. She shook her head. You've done enough. More than enough. You stood up for me in there when you didn't have to, when it cost you to break your isolation. You stood up for me first, Jackson pointed out. No one's done that in 5 years. They stood in silence for a moment, both aware that something had shifted between them during the confrontation inside. The attraction that had simmered during their days in the cabin had evolved into something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits, both outcasts in their own ways. "I should go," Maggie said finally. "Mrs. Hartwell wants me out by noon tomorrow. I need to find somewhere to stay while I figure out my next move." "My ranch has plenty of room," Jackson offered, then quickly added, "in the bunkhouse, with my ranch hands. All very proper." Maggie smiled despite everything. "Haven't you had enough of scandal?" "Scandal doesn't bother me anymore," he said simply. "Letting them destroy you does." Before she could respond, shouts erupted from down the street. Orange light flickered against the buildings. Someone screamed, "Fire! The schoolhouse is on fire!" The orange glow painted the night sky as Maggie and Jackson raced toward the schoolhouse. Townsfolk poured from buildings, forming a bucket brigade from the nearest well, but the flames had already engulfed half the structure. The bell tower collapsed in a shower of sparks just as they arrived. "My books!" Maggie cried, starting forward, but Jackson caught her arm. "It's too late," he said grimly. "The whole thing's going." They joined the bucket line, working frantically alongside people who had just condemned Maggie. But fire was the great equalizer in frontier towns when it threatened. All grudges were temporarily forgotten. Even Mrs. Morrison passed buckets with desperate efficiency. Despite their efforts, within an hour the schoolhouse was reduced to smoldering ruins. The crowd stood in exhausted silence, faces blackened with soot, watching the last timbers fall. All those books, slates, maps, everything Maggie had worked with, gone. "How did it start?" someone asked. "Saw some men near the building earlier. Old Mr. Chen said quietly. After the meeting, they were angry about something. Sheriff Ben Watson, who'd been noticeably absent from the board meeting, finally appeared. Anyone recognize these men? Chen. The laundryman hesitated, then shook his head. Too dark. But Maggie caught the look he gave her a warning. He had recognized them, but wouldn't say, "Not here, not now." Probably a lamp knocked over. Watson said dismissively, "These old buildings are tinderboxes. Everyone should go home now. Nothing more to be done." As the crowd dispersed, Maggie found herself surrounded by a small group: Elena Rodriguez, Dr. Finch, and, surprisingly, young Timothy Brennan, the banker's son who worked as a reporter for the local newspaper. "Miss O'Brien," Timothy said urgently, "I need to speak with you. About the fire. About other things." "Not here." "Doctor," Finch interrupted, glancing around nervously. "My office. All of you. Now." They followed the doctor through the dark streets. Jackson stayed close to Maggie, his presence a silent warning to anyone who might be watching. Once inside the medical office, "Doctor." Finch locked the door and pulled the curtains. "This has gone too far," he said without preamble. "The school board meeting was bad enough, but arson—" "You can't prove it was arson." Jackson said, "Can't I?" Timothy spoke up. "I saw Dobbs and Schmidt talking to those land speculators from Denver, the ones who've been trying to buy up property for the railroad extension." Maggie sank into a chair. "What does that have to do with the school?" "The school sits on prime real estate." "Doctor," Finch explained, "if the railroad comes through, that land would be worth a fortune, but as long as it's community property, used for education, it can't be sold." "But now it's burned," Elena said slowly. "Now it's cleared land." Timothy finished. "And with no teacher, no books, no building, the board might decide it's not worth rebuilding, might decide to sell instead. That's why they were so eager to dismiss me." Maggie realized. It wasn't about propriety at all. Propriety was just the excuse. "Doctor," Finch confirmed. "Your situation with Mr. McCade provided the perfect opportunity." Jackson's face had gone dark with rage. "They destroyed her reputation for money. Welcome to the New West, Timothy said bitterly, where honor is for sale and greed wears a respectable coat. We need proof, Maggie said, her teacher's mind already working. Accusations aren't enough. I might have something, Timothy admitted. I've been investigating the land deals for weeks. There are documents, telegrams, but they're in my father's bank. Your father who just voted to fire Miss O'Brien, Jackson pointed out. My father who's about to learn his son has a conscience. Timothy replied firmly. I became a journalist to tell the truth, not hide it. This is dangerous. Doctor, Finch warned. These men have already shown they'll burn buildings. What else might they do? As if in answer to his question, a rock crashed through the window, wrapped in paper. Jackson moved instinctively, shielding Maggie as glass scattered across the floor. Elena carefully retrieved the paper and unfolded it. The teacher whore and her killer should leave town before something worse than fire happens. She read, her voice trembling with anger. Subtle, Jackson said dryly, but Maggie could see the tension in his shoulders. They're trying to scare us off. She said, Smart of them. Doctor, Finch muttered. I'm not running, Maggie declared. Not this time. Those children deserve better than what this town is becoming. The children won't have any school at all if you're dead, Jackson said bluntly. Then we'd better make sure that doesn't happen, Timothy said. I can get those documents tomorrow night. The bank will be closed, but I have keys. That's burglary. Doctor, Finch protested. That's journalism, Timothy corrected. Will you help? One by one, they nodded. Even Dr. Finch, despite his fears, they spent the next hour planning, aware that they were crossing a line from which there was no return. When they finally dispersed, Jackson insisted on escorting Maggie to the boarding house. The streets were empty now, but shadows seemed to move in every alley. You should take my offer, he said quietly. Stay at the ranch until this is resolved. And confirm everyone's worst suspicions. Let them suspect, Jackson said fiercely. At least you'll be alive to be scandalized. They'd reached the boarding house, where a lamp still burned in Mrs. Hartwell's window. The proprietress was probably waiting up to ensure her disgraced boarder didn't bring further shame to the establishment. Jackson, Maggie said softly, turning to face him. What you did tonight, at the meeting, was long overdue. He interrupted. I've hidden behind my grief for too long. Sarah would have been ashamed of my cowardice. It wasn't cowardice, it was pain. Sometimes they're the same thing. He reached out, carefully brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. You reminded me there are still things worth fighting for. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Mrs. Hartwell's door opened with deliberate loudness, breaking the spell. Miss O'Brien, she called sharply. It's quite late. Good night, Mr. McCade, Maggie said formally. Stepping back. Think about my offer, he said. Please. Inside, Mrs. Hartwell waited with pursed lips. You have until noon tomorrow, as agreed, though after tonight's display, I'm tempted to put you out immediately. Tonight's display, Maggie's temper flared. You mean fighting to save the schoolhouse? How scandalous of me. Don't take that tone with me. Young woman, you've brought nothing but trouble to this town. No, Maggie said firmly. I've brought questions this town doesn't want to answer. There's a difference. She climbed the stairs to her room, leaving Mrs. Hartwell speechless. But once alone, the weight of the day crashed over her. The school was gone. Her position was gone. And now she was involved in something that could result in more than just social ruin. A soft tap at her window made her jump, but it was only Miguel, Elena's son, perched precariously on the fire escape. Miguel, what are you doing here? Mama sent me, he whispered, glancing around nervously. She said to tell you Mr. Chen saw who set the fire. It was Mr. Dobbs' men, The ones who work at his store. You're certain? Miguel nodded solemnly. Mister, Chen told Mama because he trusts her, but he's scared. They threatened his family back in China if he talks. Maggie's heart sank. Another life touched by this web of greed and intimidation. Thank you for telling me. Miguel, now go home quickly and be careful. After the boy left, Maggie sat in the darkness thinking. The corruption ran deeper than she'd imagined. How many others were being threatened or bought? How many stayed silent out of fear? A commotion in the street drew her to the window. Torches bobbed in the darkness, a group of men heading toward the edge of town. Toward Jackson's ranch, she realized with growing horror. Without thinking, she grabbed her cloak and raced down the stairs. Ignoring Mrs. Hartwell's protests, she had to warn him. Whatever these men planned, Jackson couldn't face it alone. She ran through the empty streets, her ankle protesting but functional. The moon had risen, casting silver light on the snow. In the distance, she could see the torches moving faster now, horses appearing from shadows. They were riding hard for the McCade Ranch. Maggie cut through alleys and backlots, taking shortcuts she'd learned from her students. She had to reach Jackson first, had to warn him that the violence was escalating. But as she crested the hill overlooking his property, she saw she was too late. The riders had surrounded the main house. Torchlight flickered off gun barrels, and there, on his front porch, stood Jackson McCade, unarmed and alone, facing down a mob. The wind carried voices to her hiding spot behind a cluster of rocks. You should have stayed out of it. McCade! Someone called. Dobbs' voice. She thought, kept to yourself like you have been. Hard to stay out of it when you burn down schools and threaten women? Jackson replied calmly. The teacher's none of your concern. She became my concern when you tried to destroy her for your greed. Big words from a killer. Another voice jeered. Maybe it's time someone reminded you what happens to killers in this town. You mean what happens when they defend themselves? Jackson's voice hardened. Yes, I remember. They get lynched by cowards in the night. Maggie's blood ran cold. They meant to kill him, make it look like vigilante justice. With Jackson gone and her discredited, no one would question the land deals, the fire, any of it. She had to do something. But what? She was one woman against a mob. Then she remembered Timothy had mentioned the sheriff being absent from the meeting. But Watson, for all his faults, was still a lawman, if she could reach him. As she turned to go, she heard Jackson speak again, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. If you're going to murder me, at least have the courage to do it without the masks. Let me see the faces of the men who've sold their souls for railroad money. The courtroom in the Willow Creek Town Hall had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The atmosphere crackled with tension as citizens who'd maintained careful neutrality for years were finally forced to choose sides. Judge Harold Blackwood, brought in from the territorial capital, surveyed the scene with shrewd eyes. At 60, he'd presided over everything from claim disputes to murder trials, but rarely had he seen a town so divided against itself. This court is now in session, he announced, his gavel sharp against the wooden bench. We are here to address multiple charges including arson, conspiracy to defraud, attempted murder, and corruption of public officials. Maggie sat in the witness section, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The past week had been a whirlwind since that terrible night at Jackson's ranch. She could still hear the gunshots, still see Jackson falling from his porch as Sheriff Watson and his deputies arrived just in time. Beside her, Doctor. Finch checked his medical bag nervously. He'd been the one to remove the bullet from Jackson's shoulder, to keep him alive through that critical first night. Elena Rodriguez sat on her other side, a pillar of quiet strength. At the defendant's table, Clarence Dobbs and Walter Schmidt sat with their expensive lawyer from Denver. Thomas Brennan occupied a separate table. He'd negotiated a deal to testify against his former associates in exchange for leniency. The fourth conspirator, Franklin Hayes, had fled town the night of the shooting. The prosecution may call its first witness. Judge Blackwood said. Timothy Brennan took the stand, his young face grave. As he was sworn in, his father refused to meet his eyes. Mr. Brennan. The territorial prosecutor began. Please tell the court what you discovered in your investigation. Timothy cleared his throat. I found correspondence between Mr. Dobbs, Mr. Schmidt, and representatives of the Mountain Pacific Railroad. They discussed purchasing the school land for a depot and freight yard. The letters date back 6 months long before Miss O'Brien's situation arose. Objection, the defense lawyer called. Speculation and hearsay. I have the letters here, Timothy said, producing a stack of documents, including one where Mr. Dobbs specifically mentions that removing the teacher would make the land sale easier. The crowd murmured. Judge Blackwood called for order. Continue, Mr. Brennan. The plan accelerated when Miss O'Brien was stranded in the storm with Mr. McCade. They saw an opportunity to discredit her, force her out, and then burn the school to clear the land. Mr. Dobbs arranged for his men to set the fire that same night. And how do you know this? Because I was there. A new voice spoke from the back of the room. Everyone turned as Li Chen made his way forward, his aged face set with determination. The laundryman had been in hiding since the fire, protected by the Chinese community. Mr. Chen. Judge Blackwood said, Are you volunteering to testify? Yes, honored judge. I saw Mr. Dobbs' men Carl Hewitt and James Polk leave the school with empty kerosene cans. They laughed about how the teacher problem was solved. He's lying, Dobbs burst out. You can't trust a Chinaman's word against... Mr. Dobbs, the judge said coldly. You will remain silent unless addressed. Continue, Mr. Chen. The old man straightened his shoulders. They threatened my family in China if I spoke, but Miss O'Brien risked everything to teach our children. I cannot stay silent while evil men destroy her. His testimony was devastating. He'd seen everything, remembered details that corroborated Timothy's documents. By the time he finished, Dobbs' face was ash gray. Next came Sheriff Watson, clearly uncomfortable but duty-bound. I received a report of armed men heading to the McCade Ranch. When we arrived, we found Mr. Dobbs and 5 others surrounding the house. Shots had been fired. Mr. McCade was wounded. Did the defendants claim self-defense? Watson shifted. They said McCade drew first, but we found no weapon on or near him. His rifle was inside the house, unloaded. So they shot an unarmed man. Appears so, yes. The prosecutor then called Maggie to the stand. She walked carefully, aware of every eye upon her. After being sworn in, she sat straight-backed, meeting the crowd's gaze steadily. Miss O'Brien, the prosecutor began gently. Please tell us about the night of the storm. Maggie recounted the events clearly, without embellishment. The broken wagon, the rescue, the 3 days in the cabin. She spoke of Jackson's respectful behavior, the separate sleeping arrangements, the conversations that had revealed his true character. He saved my life, she said simply. And when this town tried to destroy me for it, he stood up for me. That's why they tried to kill him, because he wouldn't let them win through intimidation. The defense may cross-examine. Judge Blackwood said. The Denver lawyer approached with a predatory smile. Miss O'Brien, isn't it true you spent 3 nights alone with Mr. McCade? Yes. And isn't it true you wore his deceased wife's clothing? My own clothes were soaked. It was that or freeze. How convenient. Tell me, Miss O'Brien, what exactly is your relationship with Mr. McCade now? Maggie lifted her chin. He is a man I deeply respect, a friend who showed me kindness when I needed it most. Just a friend, nothing more. Intimate. Objection, the prosecutor called. Relevance goes to the witness's credibility, Your Honor. The defense argued. I'll allow it, but tread carefully," the judge warned. The lawyer smiled coldly. "Miss O'Brien, are you in love with Jackson McCade?" The courtroom held its breath. Maggie was silent for a long moment, then spoke clearly. "What I feel for Mr. McCade is not the issue here. The issue is that your clients conspired to destroy the school, ruin my reputation, and commit murder for profit. My feelings, whatever they may be, don't change those facts." "You haven't answered the question." Maggie met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I care for him. I'd be a fool not to admire a man of such integrity and courage. Does that satisfy your prurient curiosity?" Gasps echoed through the room. The lawyer, thrown off by her directness, retreated. The final witness was Jackson himself. He entered slowly, his left arm still in a sling from the gunshot wound, despite his injury. He commanded the room, his presence filling the space. After being sworn in, he sat carefully, his gray eyes scanning the crowd before settling on the defendants. Mr. McCade," the prosecutor began. "Why did these men come to your ranch that night?" "To silence me," Jackson said bluntly. "I'd stood up for Miss O'Brien at the board meeting, offered to donate money to rebuild the school. I was an obstacle to their plans." "Did you threaten them?" "Never. I was on my own property, unarmed. They surrounded my house with torches and guns. When I stepped out to talk, they shot me." "The defense claims you drew first." Jackson's smile was grim. "Hard to draw a weapon you don't have. I stopped wearing guns 5 years ago, after my wife died. The whole town knows that." "Why did you stop carrying weapons?" "Because I'd use them to kill the men who murdered Sarah. Even though it was justified, I swore I'd never take another life. Violence had already cost me everything I loved." His testimony continued, painting a picture of a man who'd chosen isolation over violence, who'd borne the town's judgment rather than perpetuate a cycle of revenge. When he spoke of Maggie, his voice softened. "She reminded me that hiding from the world wasn't what Sarah would have wanted. She stood up for me when no one else would. How could I do less for her?" The defense's cross-examination was brutal, dredging up the old killings, trying to paint Jackson as a violent man who'd simply gotten what he deserved. But Jackson remained calm, answering each accusation with quiet dignity. "Yes, I killed those men," he said at one point. "They murdered my pregnant wife, but I've lived with that burden every day since. I chose exile over extending the violence, until your clients forced my hand by threatening an innocent woman." When all testimony concluded, the prosecutor made his closing argument, laying out the web of greed and corruption that had nearly destroyed the town's moral fabric. The defense countered by trying to discredit the witnesses: a hysterical woman, a Chinese immigrant, a boy betraying his father, and a known killer. Judge Blackwood retired to consider the evidence. The crowd waited in tense silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. This was more than a trial, it was a reckoning for Willow Creek itself. When the judge returned, his expression was stern. "I've seen many cases of frontier justice gone wrong, but rarely have I seen such calculated evil dressed up as respectability. The evidence is overwhelming." He looked directly at the defendants. "Clarence Dobbs and Walter Schmidt, I find you guilty of conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder. You will be remanded to territorial prison to await sentencing, which I assure you will be severe." The gavel came down with finality. Dobbs tried to protest, but the deputies were already moving. As they were led away, the courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, some cheering, others sitting in stunned silence. "Furthermore," Judge Blackwood continued, raising his voice over the noise, "I am recommending a full investigation into the town council and school board. This corruption must be rooted out completely. Thomas Brennan was sentenced to 2 years probation and heavy fines. His cooperation had saved him from prison, but not from consequences. His son Timothy was commended for his courage in exposing the truth." As the court adjourned, Maggie found herself surrounded by supporters. Elena Rodriguez hugged her tightly, Doctor. Finch shook her hand. Even some who'd shunned her before approached with apologies. But it was Jackson she looked for, finding him standing alone by the window, watching the deputies load the prisoners into a wagon. "It's over," she said softly, joining him. "Is it?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "The men who burned the school are going to prison, but the school is still ashes. You still have no position. The town is still divided." "Then we rebuild," Maggie said firmly. "The school, the trust, all of it. We rebuild better than before." "We?" Jackson asked, something vulnerable in his voice. Before Maggie could answer, Judge Blackwood approached them. "Miss O'Brien, Mr. McCade, a word." They followed him to a private chamber. The judge studied them both before speaking. "This town needs healing. It needs leadership that isn't tainted by the old corruption. Miss O'Brien, I'm recommending to the territorial government that you be appointed to oversee the rebuilding of the school, with full authority over hiring and curriculum." Maggie's breath caught. "Your Honor, I'm deeply honored, but my reputation—" "Young woman, you stood in my courtroom and admitted to caring for this man while staring down some of the most powerful forces in the territory. Your reputation is that of a person of uncommon courage and integrity. The town would be lucky to have you." He turned to Jackson. "And you, Mr. McCade, your donation to the school, is that offer still standing?" "It is," Jackson said without hesitation. "Good. This town needs to see that wealth can build up, not just tear down." The judge gathered his papers. "I leave it to you both to decide what else might need rebuilding." After he left, Maggie and Jackson stood in silence, the weight of possibility hanging between them. "So," Jackson said finally, "will you stay, rebuild the school?" "Only if you'll help," Maggie replied. "Not just with money, with your presence. This town needs to see you as I've seen you, not as a killer, but as a man who chose conscience over comfort." "And what about us?" Jackson asked quietly. "What happens to the teacher and the rancher who caused such scandal?" Maggie smiled, reaching for his uninjured hand. "Perhaps they cause a bit more scandal. The good kind. This time, the kind that shows the town what partnership and mutual respect look like." Jackson squeezed her hand gently. "Sarah would have liked you so much." "Then let's build something she would have been proud of," Maggie said. "Together." Outside, the sun was setting over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The town had been shaken to its foundations, forced to confront its own darkness. But in that upheaval lay the seeds of renewal, of a chance to become what it had always claimed to be a place of opportunity, justice, and hope. The trial was over, but the real work of rebuilding had just begun. 6 months after the trial, Willow Creek barely resembled the divided town it had been. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site where the new school was rising from the ashes of the old. Maggie stood among the wooden beams and fresh-cut lumber. Architectural plans spread on a makeshift table, directing workers with the confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. "The library goes here," she told the foreman, pointing to the eastern corner, "with the large windows to catch the morning light. Children read better in natural light." "Yes, ma'am," the foreman replied with genuine respect. Tom Sullivan had initially balked at taking orders from a woman, but Maggie's competence and Jackson's quiet support had won him over. Jackson himself stood nearby, reviewing supply lists with Timothy Brennan, who'd become the project's unofficial chronicler for the newspaper. The sight of the billionaire cowboy working openly in town still drew stares, but they were curious now rather than hostile. "The books from Denver should arrive next week," Jackson said, "along with the maps and scientific instruments you ordered." "Scientific instruments?" Timothy asked, scribbling notes. "Miss O'Brien believes in comprehensive education," Jackson explained, pride evident in his voice. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, but also natural sciences, geography, even art." "Art," Timothy's eyebrows rose. In a frontier school, beauty matters as much as practicality. Maggie interjected, joining them. We're not just teaching children to survive. We're teaching them to live. The changes in Willow Creek went beyond the new school. Judge Blackwood's investigation had led to a complete restructuring of the town council. Dr. Finch now served as mayor, with Elena Rodriguez as the first woman and first Mexican-American on the council. The old guard's resistance had crumbled when faced with the community's demand for honest leadership. Miss O'Brien. A small voice called. Miguel Rodriguez ran up. Clutching a paper, I wrote the essay you assigned, about what I want to be when I grow up. Maggie took the paper, scanning it quickly. Her eyes misted as she read Miguel's carefully penned words about becoming a teacher like Miss O'Brien, who showed us that knowledge is the greatest treasure. This is wonderful, Miguel, she said warmly. Keep this dream alive, and I'll help you achieve it. As the boy ran off, Jackson moved closer to Maggie. You've changed lives already, and the school isn't even finished. We've changed lives, she corrected. This wouldn't have been possible without you. Their relationship had evolved slowly over the months, mindful of the scrutiny they still faced. But the town had gradually accepted what was obvious to anyone with eyes. Jackson McCade and Margaret O'Brien were building something together that transcended the school project. The ranch house is too big for just me, Jackson said suddenly, surprising himself with the timing. Sarah designed it for a family, for children, for a future. Maggie's breath caught. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks. Jackson, I know we said we'd take things slowly, he continued, turning to face her fully. But these months have shown me something. Life is short and precious. Sarah taught me that. Losing her nearly destroyed me. But you brought me back to life. Maggie. Around them, work continued. But in their small bubble of space, time seemed to pause. I never expected this, Maggie said softly. When I came west, I thought I was just following a calling to teach. I never imagined that you'd fall in love with a broken-down rancher with a questionable reputation. Jackson's smile was self-deprecating. That I'd find someone who sees me as a partner, not a possession. Maggie corrected. Someone who values my mind as much as other qualities. Someone who stands beside me, not in front of me. Jackson reached for her hand, no longer caring who might see. Marry me, Maggie. Help me fill that house with laughter again. Be my wife, my partner, my equal in all things. Yes, Maggie said simply, tears streaming down her face. Yes, of course, yes. Their kiss was interrupted by whooping from the construction crew, who'd apparently been watching despite pretending to work. Even gruff Tom Sullivan was grinning. About time, someone called out. We've been taking bets on when you'd ask her. The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, but this time the gossip was tinged with warmth rather than scandal. The teacher and the rancher, their romance, had become a symbol of the town's transformation. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, on the same day the new school officially opened. It was Maggie's idea to combine the ceremonies, making the day a celebration of both personal and communal rebirth. The morning dawned clear and bright, unusual for September in Wyoming. Maggie stood in her room at the boarding house Mrs. Hartwell had apologized profusely and begged her to return, surrounded by friends helping with final preparations. You look radiant, Elena said, adjusting Maggie's veil. The dress was simple but elegant, made by the Mexican women of the community as a gift. I'm nervous, Maggie admitted. Not about marrying Jackson, about everything this represents. Change is always frightening. Dr. Finch's wife, Clara, said gently, but look what your courage has already accomplished. Through the window, they could see the new school, painted white with green trim, its bell tower reaching toward the sky. Children were already gathering with their families, dressed in their finest clothes for the dual celebration. At the ranch, Jackson adjusted his tie for the 100th time while Timothy Brennan served as unlikely best man. "Never thought I'd see the day," Timothy said. "Jackson McCade, pillar of the community." "Neither did I," Jackson admitted. "For years, I thought my life ended with Sarah. I never imagined I'd get a second chance at happiness. Miss O'Brien, soon to be Mrs. McCade, she's remarkable," Timothy observed. "You're a lucky man." "The luckiest," Jackson agreed. The ceremony took place in the new school's main room, with Judge Blackwood presiding. He'd returned specifically for the occasion, saying he wanted to see the happy ending to the story he'd helped write. As Maggie walked down the aisle between rows of students and townsfolk, she saw how much had changed. Where once there had been suspicious faces and hostile whispers, now there were smiles and tears of joy. Even Mrs. Morrison dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jackson waited at the front, his gray eyes bright with emotion. When their hands joined, Maggie felt the calluses from years of hard work, the strength that had saved her life, the gentleness that had won her heart. "Dearly beloved," Judge Blackwood began, his voice carrying to every corner, "we gather today not just to witness a union of two people, but a healing of our community. These two have shown us that love conquers fear, that courage defeats prejudice, and that from ashes can rise something beautiful and new." The vows were simple but heartfelt. Jackson promised to stand beside Maggie in all her endeavors, to support her dreams as she had revived his. Maggie vowed to build a life with him founded on mutual respect, shared purpose, and enduring love. When Judge Blackwood pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could be heard throughout Willow Creek. The kiss they shared was tender and full of promise, a seal on their second chances. The celebration moved outside, where tables had been set up for the school's opening ceremony. Maggie, still in her wedding dress, cut the ribbon on the new building while Jackson held the scissors with her. Together, they rang the bell for the first time, its clear tone carrying across the prairie. "This school," Maggie addressed the crowd, her new wedding ring catching the light, "stands as proof that a community can choose hope over fear, progress over prejudice. Every child who enters these doors will learn not just facts and figures, but how to think, how to dream, how to build a better world." The festivities continued into the evening. The new school's main room became a dance hall, with fiddle music and laughter replacing the scratch of chalk on slate. Jackson and Maggie's first dance was to an old Irish tune, a nod to her heritage and the grandfather who'd taught her about horses and seeing into souls. "No regrets?" Jackson asked as they swayed together, oblivious to the watching crowd. "Only that Sarah couldn't be here to see this," Maggie said honestly. "I think she would have been happy." "She would have loved you," Jackson confirmed, "and she would have been proud of what we've built here." As the stars emerged in the clear Wyoming sky, Timothy Brennan stood to make a toast. "To Jackson and Maggie McCade," he said, raising his glass, "who showed us that sometimes it takes outsiders to remind a community of its own values, who proved that love and learning can transform even the hardest hearts. May their union be as strong as the school they've built, and may both stand for generations to come." The crowd echoed the toast, their voices joining in celebration. In the corner, Miguel Rodriguez practiced his letters on a new slate, already dreaming of the day he'd stand where Miss O'Brien misses. McCade now stood. Lee Chen's daughter shyly showed her drawings to the art supplies that would soon fill the school's creative corner. The children of immigrants, ranchers, and merchants mingled freely, the artificial barriers of their parents' generation already beginning to crumble. Later that night, as Jackson and Maggie finally found themselves alone at the ranch house, they stood on the porch looking back toward town. The lights of Willow Creek twinkled in the distance, peaceful under the vast canopy of stars. From a chance rescue in a blizzard to this, Maggie marveled. "If someone had told me that night in your cabin where we'd end up, You'd have thought them mad, Jackson finished. As would I. But perhaps that's how the best stories unfold in ways we never expect. Speaking of stories, Maggie said with a smile, I've been thinking. The school needs books about real frontier life, not just the romanticized versions from back east. Stories about real people facing real challenges. Stories like ours, Jackson suggested, pulling her closer. Perhaps, Maggie agreed. Though I think we should wait to see how it ends first. It doesn't end, Jackson said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. It just keeps getting better. New chapters, new challenges, new triumphs, together. As they entered their home, the wind carried the faint sound of the school bell, still ringing occasionally as celebrating townsfolk took turns pulling the rope. It was the sound of change, of hope, of a future being written by those brave enough to challenge the past. The door closed behind them, but their story remained open, its pages ready to be filled with the adventures, joys, and inevitable challenges that lay ahead. In the new school, books would tell tales of courage and love. But no story would be more powerful than the living example of two people who'd found each other in a storm and built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate pasts. Willow Creek slept peacefully that night, transformed from a town divided by fear into a community united by hope. And at its heart stood a school and a marriage, twin monuments to the power of courage, compassion, and the enduring strength of love in even the wildest frontier. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please comment below, and let's connect with fellow listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Jackson and Maggie's journey. Did their story touch your heart as much as it touched mine? Let me know in the comments.